To the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's my privilege to have as my guest Bridget Cook-Burch. Her clients call her a book whisperer. She's a legit multi-time New York Times best-selling author, Wall Street Journal best-selling author. She's a mentor to writers, a trainer, a mama bear humanitarian, and she's a speaker who specializes in riveting stories of transformation. She's been on the Oprah Winfrey Show, Dateline, CNN, Good Morning America, the History Channel, and many other places. She's the CEO and co-founder of YourInspiredStory.com. I had the privilege of meeting Bridget in person in 2021 at a writing event called Scribe that was put on by Frank Viola. I appreciated her energy and her presentation, and she's been gracious enough to be on the podcast to help us think about how to tell great stories. Whether you want to write a book, whether you're a speaker, you can gain real wisdom by her process that she talks about, and we'll find out what it means to be a book whisperer. Some of her national bestsellers include books The Witness Wore Red, Shattered Silence, Skinhead Confessions, Leading Women, and also Leading Proof. She's going to challenge us to believe the power of our stories to change the world. She'll also tell you a little bit about some of the writers' retreats that she puts on. But you can find out more about her on YourInspiredStory.com or SHEROESUnited.org. If you find this episode helpful, please share it and please consider subscribing to my podcast. Let's move on to our interview. Welcome to the show, Bridget. It's so great to see you again.
Thank you, Brian. I'm so happy and honored to be here. It's great to see you again.
Well, thank you. And just to get right into the conversation, can you just sort of set up your career a little bit with us or for us by sharing some key moments in your personal or spiritual journey that led you to your work as literally a New York Times best-selling author multiple times and now a mentor to other authors?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I will tell you that just like everyone, I have a story. Everybody's got an extraordinary story. And my favorite thing is to find out your story, other people's stories. But I have learned that I have to put my money where my mouth is and share my story from time to time. So I will share. I had some pretty significant spiritual experiences when I was a kid, and always had a deep and inexplicable yearning for God, to have this closeness and connection. And but as I began my life journey, it was kind of funny. I grew up Catholic, and I grew up in a Mormon town, and so I had these dichotomies of things that were always facing me. I was in college, and I was working 3 jobs and going to school and just trying to make ends meet, and I was fierily independent. And I ended up in the hospital. I had fissures and ulcers in my colon. I had a horrific infection, and my body was literally eating itself from the inside out. And I was dying. And I knew I was in a lot of trouble, but it was when I heard 2 nurses outside in the corridor telling me that I was not going to make it until morning that I realized my time on the planet was going to be done. I wasn't going to be here anymore. And my mother had been praying like crazy. My father was a deacon in the Catholic Church. He'd been praying like crazy. And I believe in intercessory prayers. I also believe that at that moment, my heart not wanting to be done, I knew in that moment I had not fulfilled the measure of my creation. Had no idea what that was. I just knew I hadn't done it. And I was very, very sad. And then I had a miraculous appearance in my hospital room where unconditional love was just so apparent. Like every cell in my body was vibrating with his unconditional love. And I was given information that one of the antibiotics they were giving me was killing me. I was allergic to it, but had never had it before, so nobody knew. And I was told I was being given a second chance at life, this second chance to fulfill the measure of my creation, and
Wow.
knocked my socks off. Yeah, just totally changed my world. And especially, it told the story that I was telling me about myself. And so I went off, was able to get out of the hospital within 24 hours on my own power because of the information that I was given about that antibiotic. But it was being able to look into the mirror and see love there for the first time in my life. And then to be able to go out amongst humanity. And no matter where I looked, I saw love in every person's eyes. And it completely changed the way I saw humanity. So I got to work with some gang kids in Denver, some high-risk gang youth. And, these were the kids that lived life in a box because mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, aunt and uncle, everybody's a gang member. And I saw what would happen when someone loved them enough to show them a different way, and their perspectives would expand. And when they could see even just an inkling outside of that box, where a promise, of hope, a promise of something greater within them, then some of them would take it. And that's when I fell in love with the human soul and writing stories of transformation. So I love love stories. I love happy ending stories. I love all kinds of stories, but my favorite stories ended up being transformational stories. So people living literally in the depths of hell, but then coming out on the other side of their character arc, being great servants, great contributions to the world, great and incredible leaders on the planet. So those are my favorite stories.
Wow, that is so much to unpack there. I almost could just follow back up on that, but I love what you said about that moment of unconditional love, because I haven't really to talk about my podcast yet, but I literally just got zapped with that, and I think I've had it before, but just like 2 weeks ago, and it just literally changed my whole perspective. I could see it on your face, and what a gift that you got when you were young, and you've been able to bring that to your mission your whole life. And I love the title you have. You're a book whisperer, and I'm going to guess some of our listeners have heard of like a horse whisperer or a dog whisperer, but what's a book whisperer, and how does that link back to what you just shared about stories of transformation?
I think, frankly, it's my clients that kept calling me that. So finally I owned it. But I can hear in people sharing with me their story and in their writings. And I somehow get an intuitive sense of deeper things to pull out from them, and can see patterns of rises and falls in their heroes and sheroes journeys, and recognize oftentimes the places where they've been downplaying or thinking, oh, that's just normal. Doesn't everybody go through that? It's like, no, that's epic. This gets to be brought out into the world. Do you realize how remarkable you are? And so that, I think, is the gift that came from there, is recognizing that, a lot of times, Brian, when we write a book, especially if we're a minister or a leader or pastor or someone who has a tribe, we often kind of want to showcase this life that just kind of goes along, and then all of a sudden there's my climax, there's this great thing that you need to see. And what oftentimes leaders don't understand is that it's the rises and falls that we all can identify with, no matter who we are, that we can, the circumstances are different, but the emotions are the same. And when we're leaders and we let our walls down and we show rises and true falls and even dark night of the soul, and then a real rise from that, then all of a sudden you have readers that want to get behind you. You're creating more than just a story, it's your movement. They see why you're so passionate about what you're passionate about. And so that's what has come from this, is just this ability to see, where people are not playing epic in their life, and they're not writing juicy, as I know you love that term, where they're not exposing all the beautiful, messy, and delicious nuances of being human and what it's all about, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And I think we're going to get a little bit into that, a little more into the weeds in that in just a minute. It's so compelling, but I'm just curious, do you have have you found a question that you ask a writer that just sort of breaks them out of like you said, you just have this kind of wouldn't say a boring story, but they're like, when you sense they're holding back, do you have a question you ask? Do you just sit and stare at them? I mean, I mean, I don't want to take your secret sauce, but do you have like a kind of almost like a question that you just found tends to really open a person up, or at least crack them a little bit to get at what you sense is really within them?
Yeah, there's a couple things. One is, when people have been on this journey, they generally have learned so much that they come back with what we call the elixir of life, and it's their secret sauce. And so I'll ask them, what is your secret sauce? What is it that makes you unique and different? And why do you want to use this to help other people? And if they haven't told me the deeper stories, usually by that point they will, because it is their impetus, private or not, of wanting to share, wanting to help other people who've been, going through what they're going through, or prevent people from going through something that was hard and scary and dark, and yet they rose. So that, and oftentimes too, I've helped a lot of people with, older gentlemen and women who want to leave a legacy. And sometimes it's just for their family, but sometimes it's for a bigger organization or something that they've built. And so they're writing their story. And, I have a lot of them that want to just write down mostly the accolades and why they received it and what that was. The only thing is that ends up oftentimes being this dusty tome that doesn't ever get read. It just sits on the shelf. And so the question I say is, do you want your grandson to look at you and go, wow, grandpa, grandma did all these things. I can never be like them. Or do you want them to see where you fell and then you rose, and where you fell again and where you rose, and where you finally came to know yourself and your strength and who you are? And so I often ask, what are the 3 greatest obstacles you have ever overcome? And how did you overcome them? All of a sudden, the book goes 20 levels deeper than usually what they were thinking of. And then they recognize that these other stories that they wanted to share are all built around those trifle cycles, what we call them, their rises and falls. And they recognize, I do have something more epic to share.
So good. And, speaking of just writing, I mean, you went from being sick and in this compelling story where you essentially have your own kind of resurrection. Were you already writing at that time? At what point did you become a writer? Or maybe who were some of maybe your favorite authors that inspired or influenced you? And I'll just leave it at that. Talk a little bit about your influences, please.
Well, I had an English teacher from mother. Oh. And she was not indulgent about a lot of things, but she was incredibly indulgent about the amount of material that I could read. I loved to read. So I had a lot of late library finds, but I read out the school library, I read out the bookmobile, and then finally she let me go downtown to the city library and started reading that all out. And the librarians knew me by name. So I didn't really start writing until about junior high. I won a couple of awards for writing, but then I kind of put it away because, I thought I had to have this professional career. And in my professional career, I've done other things, PR, a phone book, ran a trucking company, and built that from a 1-truck wonder to 15 trucks and 55 trailers in my professional career. But my passion has always been in writing. And I had lots of influences, but it's interesting that, in 3rd grade, I was reading things that people were supposed to be reading in high school. But they affected me deeply. So, I loved adventure stories and fiction and love stories. I also loved Christian stories about communist countries, and what they had to go through. Some of the books that hit me hardest when I was young had to do with social justice and how we treat each other as humanity. The Diary of Anne Frank, I'll never forget what that did to me as a little girl, and promises I made myself under the tree when I was reading them, that if I, as an adult, had choices to make, would I make a choice of courage instead of fear and cowardice? And really affected me more than I even realized. So stories like that were really brilliant. And then because of my near-death experience, I have studied worldwide religions and worldwide near-death experiences, and then just people's journeys. So I have too many authors to mention, but I'll just say I love the plethora of influences that I've had. So that's been beautiful. And I would like to share one thing I had, because it might be helpful for some of your listeners. And that is, I was working on this book, The Witness Wore Red, and it was about the 19th wife of 65 women. And she'd been raised in this FLDS, so it was an extremist version of a religion. And in this very tight society, it was, they were never encouraged to have friends in the outside world. They were supposed to just stay really tight knit and closed off. But there was a violin teacher in her past that her mother would permit her to go to because she was a violin virtuoso. And she would go to this gentleman's shop, and he ended up being one of those people in the outside world that was so loving and supportive and compassionate that as she grew up, she said, they cannot all be evil on the outside because he's too good. Well, I had the opportunity to interview him when we were working on our book together, and Rebecca went outside to make a phone call, and Peter Pryor, the violin maker, he was shaving this beautiful back of a violin and smoothing and sanding. And as he did so, he looked out the window, and there was construction that was taking place outside. And he said, I had a choice of what I would do in my life. I could be one of these construction workers, and there is so much honor in what they do. I'm grateful for them every day as I come to my shop, that there are beautiful roads here, that, our society takes care of each other in this way. He said, but I had a choice to make. Would I be a construction worker or would I be a violin maker? And he said, I made my choice, and I've been creating beautiful music ever since. And what he did not know at the time was that I was running a business as a trucking company owner and a partner. And I was debating, because here I was writing this book and loving every minute of it. And my books have been on Oprah and Dr. Phil and some of these other things. But, was I going to be a trucking company owner, or was I going to be a writer? And in that moment, I chose that I was going to live my passion. And it was not long after that I left my trucking company, started my Your Inspired Story, and I have not regretted a day of it ever since. And so I just feel that when you're passionate about something and you've been naturally blessed with certain gifts, talents, and abilities, and others can be learned, because I've certainly learned a lot through the years, is, to let this, supreme intelligence and beautiful force that is known by so many names, that you and I call God, but to let God be a co-creator with you in your most passionate and beautiful life. And don't discount your own story.
That's so powerful, and it's just so interesting, because I know that you use like the hero's journey stuff when you're teaching writing, and in your own words, you had that threshold moment when you have a guide that tells you his story, and then you cross that your own Rubicon, so to speak, and make that decisive move. So is what you just described. That's what's epic writing is, right? You grab a hold of that and live into it. Could you want to say any more about like just this hero's journey, or how that's a model, or what makes a story epic?
Yeah, there's a famous quote in writing that says, either write something worth reading or live something worth writing.
Oh, wow.
And I love that. And I tell my clients all the time, live juicy so you can write juicy. And it's hard, especially the last few years with COVID. Like, I have spent so much time behind this desk. And yet, I'm excited to do some humanitarian work in 2023. I'm going to Italy to teach, and Ireland in 2022, regardless of what we're facing, just, making those choices. But I'm learning how in my own life to choose epic instead of plain small. And it's always the relationships. It is always the relationships where the juiciest stories come from. Because in relationships, new people, new adventures, new terrain, new conversations, we learn more about ourselves than we do sitting at home behind a desk, getting our work done. We still got to get our work done. So there's a balance, live and write, be the best father, mother, grandmother, grandfather, friend, husband, wife, servant as you can be and write. And there's a challenge in there, but it's a beautiful challenge.
That's so good. And that may just be the answer to the question I wanted to follow up with, which is, how does a writer herself or himself have to change to really write that way? And I don't know if that was the answer to that, or you would even say a little bit more. Because you find when you're working with somebody that you can see the great book, I mean, they need to make that shift to this juicy epic style. Like, so what ways have you seen that a person needs to change? And maybe that's even part of your own story.
Yeah, I think because I've usually been the one behind the camera, behind the computer, behind the pen, and it's only been in the last few years that I think I've taken my own story seriously. I had an author who was giving me a thank you gift, and it turned out to be a DNA kit. And she said, I don't think your own story is going to be done until you do this, because she knew that I'd been adopted at 6 months and that I had kind of just put that on the shelf, because I really honor my parents who raised me. They were incredible, beautiful, compassionate, educated, loving people. They weren't perfect, but they were very, very perfect for me. And I just, anyway, so the thought of finding where I came from felt almost like treachery. It felt disloyal to them. And that DNA test sat on my desk for months. And in a story that I've been working on with a co-author, I went back to Burlington, Vermont, and I stood on the doorstep of a killer. We didn't know if he was mentally ill or if he was on drugs or both. We just knew that he was a killer. And I stood on his doorstep, had a getaway car behind and a guard beside me. But I ended up interviewing him for 7.5 hours. And I was not nearly as terrified to meet him and interview him as I was to spit into this DNA kit and send it off. But that opened a whole new world for me. I've now found my birth parents. There has been story after story after story that I had hidden from, that I had been afraid to look at. I had been playing small and not epic in my own story. So now I share that as I'm teaching, and everybody say, when are you gonna write that one? And I will, but I've been living it. I've been really present. I've been just being with the people in my new relationships, my mother, my father, and all of these glorious, I have all these new siblings. I have 89 new immediate family members. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. That's amazing.
And wonderful. But to answer your question, what we have to change, I don't think it's a matter of changing. I think there's two things. One, Brian, is a matter of priority. Usually when someone wants to write a book, it's keeping them up at night. They have ideas. They're seeing other people's pain. They know they have a solution or solutions. They know that what they've been through can really serve someone else. And they hear it from other people. They just don't know how to put it down. And so it's really making sure you get the right resources and, talk to people who have written books, talk to book coaches, talk to someone about your story and what it can offer to the world. And then, being that while you're being everything else, but giving yourself permission to write when you can. When I was working on The Witness Wore Red, I was a single mom at the time with 3 young children, all going to school. And running a trucking company and a phone book and supposed to be writing this book. But it was one of those social change, enlightenment books that to me needed to help change a culture and to educate a nation and the world. And it's done that. It's has helped to dismantle an organized crime unit in the name of God because of her courage, Rebecca Mussers. And so I knew it got to be written. And what it took was a little element of sacrifice for a while. So I would get up at 4:30 in the morning. She and I would meet together. We would pray, and our children would still be asleep. And I would interview her, and we would write, and we would finagle, and we would do what needed to be done. And our kids would wake up, and we would send them off to school, and we'd go do what we needed to do for the day. So luckily, I don't have to do that every day anymore. But there are times, where we might sacrifice a little bit of something. But one thing I'd love to share, Brian, is there's a difference between sacrifice and making sacred. And what we did for that time was we made it sacred. And it did not feel like a sacrifice. Like sometimes I was overtired, and I have a picture that I still had my Christmas tree up on Valentine's Day because some of the things that didn't get done, but the things that were so important did get done. And I think your listeners know what that means,
No, that was powerful, and thanks for sharing that really personal story about yourself too. Because just thank you for that gift to all of us. And one of my favorite prayers, again, this is about you, not about me, but one of the favorite prayers I like to use is, "Oh God, help me believe the truth about myself, no matter how beautiful it is," and just sit with that and see what comes out, to see what what is there to share, and what's the thing that I'm afraid of that might come up that is actually beautiful, and you just shine it up a little bit. So just thank you for sharing that. And I love this.
That is a gorgeous prayer. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, you're welcome. It comes from a spiritual writer named Macrina Vidercare. So, but I heard it so I will give her credit for that. But it's super powerful, and you sensed it, right? It's almost like a trick prayer, actually.
It is a trick prayer.
But I love the sacrifice versus making sacred. That's so a beautiful way to talk about that. And I think it's going to help everybody listening. Now here's a question that obviously you could do your whole workshop probably is about this, but maybe you can just tease this out just a little bit. And I totally get that it's an unfair question. It's kind of like asking me, "Hey, Brian, what's the Bible about?" or whatever. but like, what's your general advice? You work with authors, I'm sure, at a spectrum, like first-time authors, and then maybe for a more seasoned writer. Is there some things in common? Is there specifics that you get at? Can you just spend just a couple minutes giving some general advice on writing?
Yeah. Fiction and nonfiction are different. And I know you have both listeners, but probably more nonfiction. So I'll speak to that. Although I'll say to fiction, have fun, be curious, play with your writing, enjoy that. And same thing with nonfiction. With nonfiction, one of the things that I have found over and over and over again with both seasoned authors and also brand new beginners is that, oftentimes we'll write our recollections, and because we remember them, they have significant meaning to us. They have woven their threads through our tapestry, but we don't always see it as a whole. And so something that is just so significantly powerful is to have a timeline, to give yourself permission. And it's really tough for writers that are like, I got deadlines, I got to get this out, I got to have the book done. But I found on a scale of 1 to 10, if you give it a master 11, putting together a chronological timeline, and both the left brain and the right brain, like here's the dates when all of these things happened, every rite of passage, baptisms, blessings, this, that, the other, marriages, children being born, those kinds of things. But then the juicy right brain stories that go along with them and in between them and around them, all of a sudden we move from recollections to seeing our patterns and our rises and falls in black and white right before us. And a lot of the things that we didn't want to look at or that were scary to us, we're seeing now. And I get emotional about this, but then we also see our strengths, our perseverance, our ability to overcome, the many times spiritually or mentally or physically that we've been down and out. And, through help, through our own tenacity, through whatever it might be in our own individual stories, where we were able to overcome and renew and renaissance and rethink and a new iteration of ourselves. But to give ourselves credit for all of those. And I have this one woman, Martina, and she just glows pink when I talk about her, but she's in her 70s and she did this after working on her autobiography. And she said, I like me better now. I understand me better now. Because it wasn't just these different groups of stories, it was how it was all this beautiful tapestry of her life that was woven together. When she reacted, when she made a decision about herself, when she went in one direction or another. And all of a sudden, just full of love for herself and her journey, and more for other people too, because of recognizing, the miraculous.
I love that. That's fantastic advice. Can you say something about that? This wasn't on the questions I sent you, but to pull that off and then to write it down. I mean, it's one thing doing the drafts, but if you write a book, you got to edit over and over again. How do you help somebody to fall in love with the editing process, which in a sense, your timeline kind of is a pre-edit, right? But that's where the work really is, right? You create a story and then you got to go back and rework it. So do you have advice for falling in love with editing, which is, I guess, the dirty secret of actually creating a great book, right?
It is, because you're right. It's where a lot of the work really happens. Because, the first couple of drafts, we're figuring out what we're going to write. We're healing. We're getting it together. And then we start writing for our avatar, who we're directing this message for precisely, so that we can reach them. And it's work, to go back, to take out the tangents, to fill in the story holes, to make sure we're coalescing all these deep threads of meaning, and that it will be, as meaningful or even more for the reader than it was for us in the writing. And it takes work. But I will tell you, the magic is in the rewrite. Because, those first couple of grueling drafts are like, wow. And it's where people stop 3 feet from gold, because they're like, there isn't anything worthwhile in here, and it's taken me forever, and it's crap, and I don't like it, because we get sick of our own stories. But this is where I suggest that you not only walk away from it for a couple weeks, come back and read the whole thing top to bottom with fresh eyes, as if you are a reader. You're going to see things right away, like, wow, I didn't realize I left that out, or wow, this is really good. And you'll see some of those elements in there and make it tighter and make it better. And then I recommend that you have a beta reader process, where you send it out to just a small handful of people, 2 of whom do not know you, and allow them to give you honest feedback. For my authors, I have a template called Help Me Read Effectively, but you have questions that you'll ask them, and then you get this feedback back. And what's hard is, sometimes someone will read the feedback and they're like, crap, I've got to change my whole book. But you never change the book based on one reader's feedback. Instead, you look at the pattern of, what are the 5 people telling me? Is there times 2 or more said this is boring, or I had to put the book down, I had to go take the dog out, and it took me a while to get back to it, or are there places where they said, this is where I found myself in your story. Thank you so much. And you're like, okay, I'm going to keep this. I'm going to make this pace faster here. I'm going to, make this principle stronger, just depending on what kind of book you're writing. But feedback from a good 5 people that are not, yes men or yes women saying, Brian, yeah, the whole thing is great, thanks for letting me read it, but didn't give you any feedback. You don't want that. You want someone that's going to give you real, true, honest feedback of what they got out of it. And then going back in and making that can be difficult and so rewarding, because you've done the hard work before you go to publishing. There's a lot of people who've written and they didn't get any input on their books whatsoever. And then they went to publish, and then they get these reviews and they're like, I totally missed the mark. Writing took me forever. This sucks. I'm not getting the reviews that I want, and that can be really painful. Very few people have the ability to just, download a book of great wonders and get it straight out without other input. It's good for us to get feedback. And so, then doing that last rewrite, and I tell everyone, please get an editor, because we have so many options for publishing these days. But there are things that even the professionals, when it's our own work, we don't see. And so I always have my own work edited, and I learned some great lessons going on Oprah. So, but I always have someone else edit my work. And whatever you're doing, if you're self or indie publishing, please be sure to have an editor look at your work before it goes to print.
That's so good. And can you just say a couple things? Is writer's block a real thing? And what are some easy tricks if there's a trick to get yourself just to sit down and write?
Yeah, writer's block is a real thing. It plagues a lot of people. It plagues nearly every good and great writer I know too. It doesn't matter how far along you are, but what matters is getting your butt in the seat and sitting, and just continuing with the process. When you train your brain, some of the things I do is, I like to get some green tea. I like to sometimes write a candle. I have a playlist of music. I put myself in a certain way, and then I just get to it. That's telling my body and my brain, it is time for us to write, and we're going to do this master brain work. One thing that a lot of people really do struggle with is that their left brain, especially if you're analytical, a numbers kind of person, chronological, very logical in nature, your left brain probably overpowers your right brain. So that editor can sometimes get in there, even your first sentence, your first paragraph, and then you were like, gosh, I sat down to write this juicy, wonderful story, and I can't even get it out. So I recommend that you tell your left brain, hey, I've got a job for you to do, but after I write this story, I'm going to let you go back and edit it. But for right now, I'm not going to care if it's grammatically correct. I'm not going to care if everything is spelling and punctuated correctly. We're just going to go to town writing this beautiful story or this heart-wrenching story or whatever it might be. And then I'll let you go back and edit it. And so the left brain will be quiet for a little while because it knows you haven't forgotten it. And it knows it's going to be safe because you're going to let it edit. And then you use your right brain and you just get it all out. And then your left brain becomes your best friend, because as an editor, it will help you make sure that you make sense of this beautiful, more emotional, flowery piece of writing that has the tenderness or the beauty or the illustration to touch another person's soul, but you're also taking them somewhere. So usually writer's block has to do with just being blocked in one or the other of those categories. So giving yourself permission is important.
That's so good. And everybody's listening. We all can see what it get called a book whisperer, because you just made that sound so good. And it's even like it's almost like a spiritual practice. Then it's just like if you have a rhythm for your life, you create the environment, and then it flows out. So thank you. That was really powerful. And to be fair to your time, I'm going to move to the kind of the quick questions I like to ask at the end. Again, thanks for being my guest. And I always love to ask folks like, what's next for you? Is there a book that you're actually afraid to write that you're trying to get to come out now?
Well, I'll tell you, I've got a beautiful book of international significance called Divine Turbulence. Wow. And it's about a gentleman whose parents were murdered on a U.S. Army base in Germany, murder-suicide. And he went from the frying pan into the fire, into a den of abuse. And he had to decide at one point if he would be a bitter man or a better man because of it. He ended up becoming an artist and a sculptor, and he sculpted the monument called the Statue of Responsibility, which was Viktor Frankl's dream, that the United States would have a Statue of Liberty on the East Coast and a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. And Gary Lee Price has become the sculptor for the Statue of Responsibility. And so his book is going to be out this year, and in 2022. And I could not be more thrilled. And the story that I am most afraid to write is my own story. So just like your listeners, I have to make it a priority and give myself permission to be epic and to and then just to make sure that I have time. So one of the things that I'm doing as I'm working on my 2022 calendar is putting in specific times to write and specific times to work on my own story and give myself permission that, yes, I have these other deadlines. Yes, I have clients. Yes, I have things that get to be done, and I can be a priority. I haven't always been a priority in my own life. So this is new for me. It's good for me.
Good. It's good. Do you have like daily rhythms or spiritual practices that allow you to be who you are and to really continue to hone? I mean, that wonderful experience that you had and on literally on your deathbed that made you feel loved. How do you keep centered on that? Do you have practices that you do?
Well, I'm a little maybe unusual compared to some, but where I feel most connected to Christ and to God is when I'm talking to other people and when I'm listening to their stories.
Yeah.
There is a sense of worship in that for me.
Wow.
And when I don't let that go, it's something that permeates my whole life and my whole joy. And so that is a form of worship for me. And I love to go out in nature. I have lots of different spiritual, writings, biblical and reflective, meditative, that I enjoy little bits at a time. And then I love to ponder them in nature whenever possible. And I am doing some of those in yoga as a form of prayer, and I had never thought of yoga as being prayer, but it is prayer and movement. And so that form of meditative movement, as I think about these scriptures or ponderings, it's embodying some of the things that make life important to me.
That's so good. And I'd have to say, we met once in person at an event. There was 50 or 60 people there, but I do remember, even though it was a lot of people, but even the way you spoke with me, I sensed that you were really listening deeply. And so I can see how that's a spiritual practice for you, because that really impressed me when I met you and I watched you move around and spend a little bit of time with, I don't know if I got to talk to everybody, but I noticed that about you. So I think that's, I didn't realize that was a spiritual practice, but I definitely see how you do that. And that was, that spoke to me. I remember that. So that was awesome. I love that. What about books? And I know this is the impossible, and you've been reading since you were a kid and you were a great reader. So if you're just going to pick 2 or 3 books that have really shaped you deeply, personally or spiritually, and I usually say other than like, say, the Bible or whatever, but if you want to use that, you can. But what would be a couple of the books that have really impacted you powerfully over the course of your life?
Well, I definitely would say the Bible for sure. Not as an out, but just because it is filled with stories. It is filled with epic stories, that help us to remind. And when we liken ourselves to the people in the stories, it's what we're doing as writers now, is creating stories that other people would liken themselves to us to be able to learn from, So I learn from that every day, the biblical. You'll crack up, but one of it was a series of books by C.S. Lewis. And there was the sacred in the ordinary and the magical in the momentary, and to recognize deep values and Christianity in a that was disguised and undisguised in such beautiful ways. Anyway, what I have loved about that, and it colored my world from that day forward with anything I read, and that was, that when we're passionate about creation, when we're passionate about sharing, that the ultimate message comes through, no matter what. And that there can be great contribution and value in stories. I struggle a little bit in today's society because there are a lot of themes of destruction, a lot of themes of that people and humanity and value systems are not important. And I worry sometimes for, people growing up and being educated by those particular things, because I just think about, not in a judgmental way, but just in kind of a sad and a longing way, that they could also learn from, deeper stories of transformation and of hope and of healing and connection and community. So these are the stories that I find today. When I find them, that I just love them. Stories of overcoming, stories of spiritual connection, stories of transformation. So there are a lot, and it's hard for me to mention, but maybe I could send you a list. There's a lot. There's been a few beautiful ones lately on forgiveness, themes of forgiveness that have been really Christian forgiveness across the board. There's a woman that wrote a book called How to Forgive What You Can't Forget. And that was from a Christian perspective. And I felt that was so valuable for so many people. And I've just read so many good ones. A really great memoir of overcoming is called Educated by Tara Westover. And that's been a very, very good one. It reminds me a little bit of The Witness Were Read, just because of the difficulties faced in childhood and teenage years, and the upbringing and the overcoming of beliefs to the point of breaking out and absolutely choosing to have a spiritual independence and a religious independence and a loving independence and a brilliant mind, especially for a young woman. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I saw her get interviewed on Oprah last year or so about that book. I do remember listening to her interview, so I know exactly what you're talking about. That's a great book, and that is the impossible question if you keep reading all the time. Because it's like, what's my favorite book today or whatever. So that's so good. Well, last question. If folks want to reach out to you, obviously I'm going to list all the books that you've written and these books you recommended, but if they want to find out more about your work, your role as a book whisperer, the writing retreats you do, and get in contact with you, what would be the easiest way to find you, Bridget?
The easiest way is on our website, and it's yourinspiredstory.com. So just yourinspiredstory.com. It lists our events, ways to contact me. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram as well. But yourinspiredstory.com would be the smartest way. And I would love to hear from you and get a chance to get to know you and your epic stories.
Well, Bridget, this has been really helpful for me personally in ways that I may tell you if I have a second after we're done. But I know the folks that I work with that listen to the podcast, and other pastors and just people I haven't even met yet that are listening. This was awesome. So grateful for the way that God has used you, and that you've, again, sort of surrendered into this calling that you have out of joy, and that how you really serve others. And you've captured, you've got that ability of what the great teacher is, that you're consciously competent. So you know what greatness looks like, and you're actually able to explain it so somebody can follow along with you instead of just being blown away by, how good of a writer you are. So thank you for just sharing us some morsels today. That was a real wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Brian. I've appreciated it. And I will say, the world is hungry for leadership right now, hungry for conscious, loving, compassionate, inclusive leadership. So I'm delighted with the work you're doing. I just think it's wonderful. And for you and the people that you work with, thank you for being the leaders you are.
And thank you, everyone, for listening all the way to the end of this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. Until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope in the world. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. If you found this episode helpful, would you please share it with friends through your social media networks, as well as leaving a review to help other people find it? If you're interested in any of the resources mentioned, please check out the show notes. And let me again remind you, if you're interested in contemplative practices, my latest book, Centering Prayer, Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life, is now available in paperback Or on Kindle, recommend ordering it off of Amazon. If you want to do a large order, I would reach out directly to Paraclete Press. Ask for Sister Estelle, and you can get some deep discounts if you're interested in buying, say, any quantity over of at least 3 or more copies. You can get good discounts directly from Paraclete. Thank you so much for the privilege of serving you, and we'll see you next time.